everybody's having a good week. It sounds like it's about to storm here. I can hear the thunder rolling in the distance, so any minute now I'm sure it'll be pouring rain and thundering and lightning. It's probably pretty fitting for recording the podcast, but in case you hear the thunder. Alright, so let's get started. I'm actually going to talk about a cemetery in Guadalajara, Mexico. It's called the Santa Paula Cemetry. It seems to have quite the, history or following for paranormal for sure. Some of the stories are better than the others. I'm going to save the best one for the last one, of course. So the cemetery itself was built in 1848, and it was basically encompassed all kinds of different types of architecture, from neoclassica to like a French theme. There's a chapel in the middle that has a Egyptian inspired roof. So they definitely picked a little bit of everything from all around Mexico and kind of built it into this one cemetery. When they built the cemetery back in the 1800s, back then they actually had it divided into two sides. There was a side for the wealthy, and then the side for the not so wealthy. Had designated nicer areas for, how much money you had and what you were going to pay to be buried, and then a spot for everybody else. Many years later, the cemetery, I think, was redesigned and re-outlaid, and they got rid of the divide. So pretty much, if there's still room in the cemetery, you could be buried on either side. So let me start some of our legends of the cemetery. The first one dates back to May of 1882. A very large storm, probably much like about to happen here, had hit the city of Guadalajara. A young couple had a young son who was believed to be less than 10. So he was super young, and he was extremely afraid of the dark, much like children today. He had always slept with his windows open, the blinds open, or whatever they used, cloths back, in the 1800s, and there had been 2 torches that were lit outside his window for his nightlight. However, when this big storm came, they blew out those torches. So this poor little kid is in the dark, in a storm, and I'm sure scared to death. So the next morning, his mother comes in the room, and when she got in there, mother's intuition, she immediately knew something was off. The room felt extremely cold, and she had found her son motionless, and he was just as cold as the room. So they, called the doctors and whatnot, and they had determined that he had actually died of a heart attack from being so afraid of the dark. So, they did what they had to do, and they buried him. Of course, back then they didn't have all the social media we have now, so they just spread rumors amongst the town. And a lot of people were saying that the little boy's heart had actually exploded, and because he had died such a horrible death, they believed it was due to some kind of curse on the boy or on the family, or that it was demons. Because, that's everybody's go-to in the 1800s. If it's bad, it's demons. So, as any, family would do, they buried the young boy in the Santa Paula Cemetery. The next morning, after his burial, the townspeople are out amongst, for the day, and they find his coffin to be actually out of the ground and next to the hole. Okay, weird. So the groundskeeper put it back in the hole, bury it, all well is good. The next morning they come back, and the same thing has happened. It is outside the hole again. So the parents get a little perturbed, like, dude, what the hell? Why, who's taking this kid's coffin out of the ground? Like, we've got enough to deal with. Now we got to deal with crazy grave robbers, or I don't even know what they would be, because they weren't stealing them, they were just putting them outside. So they continued to put it back in the ground, bury him again. This went on for 9 straight days. And finally the parents were like, this is weird. Something is just not right. So they thought about it and realized that the little boy was afraid of the dark. And by putting him in the ground, he's in total darkness. So they believed that he didn't want to be in the dark. And maybe his soul or whatever, was getting that coffin out of the ground into the light where he was more comfortable. So they finally decided to actually build an above-ground coffin for him. and it sat on 4 pillars, and that way it was always in the light, and he wouldn't be scared of the dark. Since this has happened, many people who have visited the cemetery have said they've either seen or heard a young boy who seems to match his description in and around where his coffin is. Some have even said they've seen balloons floating evenly about 3 or 4 feet off the ground as if they were being carried by a small child, but never seeing the child and the balloons never flying off on their own. Maybe now that he's out of the ground and he's in the light, he's happy and feels more comfortable, and he just walks around the cemetery. So that's our first legend. A little different. The second legend of the Santa Paula Cemetery is actually about a pirate. So they don't give me a date on when this occurred with the pirate, but we'll just say, pirate time. He was a young pirate, sailed the Pacific, and like many other pirates, he often attacked ships that he knew that he'd be able to steal treasure and jewels and gold or whatever, and did this for a long time. He was pretty good at it. He was able to get what he wanted and sail away and survived. Once he reached middle age, he decided that, the pirate's life is no longer for him, and he was ready to settle down and decided he was going to start his life in Guadalajara. Why not? So he got there and met a woman and started a family, had a son, and never told his son what his former life was, just that he started his life and had a kid. Nothing ever prior to that. And sometime between him arriving in Guadalajara and starting his family, he stashed his treasure. He hid it so no one could find it. It would be safe, just like any other good pirate would do. It was supposedly hidden somewhere in Guadalajara because that's where he lived, and that way he could have access to it. However, a few months after he admittedly hid the treasure, he dies, and there's no map. There's no one that knew what he did, no one he told, so there is treasure hidden no one's ever been able to find. So the legend that goes with his grave and in the cemetery says that if a devout person, I'm going to assume a devout Catholic, comes and visits his grave at midnight, has to be at midnight, and prays the rosary for his tortured soul, that he will come and tell that person where the treasure is. However, this has never happened, and I am sure there have been many, many, many people that have done it, who have showed up at midnight and prayed the rosary to see if he would show up. Now, here's my thing. If they're looking for a devout Catholic or Christian or whatever, then there's somewhere in the Bible, I'm sure of it, that you take, like priests or somewhere along the line, it must say that you give up the idea of being rich, that if you have money, you're going to give it back to the church or donate it to the poor. So if you're going to his grave to pray the rosary for his tortured soul in hopes for a reward of tons of riches, then you're not really devout. So if that's what the legend says, then no one's ever going to fit it. He's never going to come and tell you, if it's true, where the money is, because you're doing it based on greed. So, but if someone doesn't know and maybe they're just super religious and they pray day and night and show up, maybe he'll come for them. But it doesn't sound like anyone is ever going to get that money. So I know I wouldn't. Our next one, let's see. Okay, here we go. This one, a little odd, kind of sad, and it's weird. It does involve a child, but actually is connected to the hospital. So when they built the cemetery in the 1800s, there was a hospital next door. I think a civic hospital. So our third story takes place in the hospital. There was a young boy named Santiago who was suffering from a terminal stomach ailment of some sort. Some stories say they believed it was some kind of cancer, but whatever it was terminal. His mom came to visit him, and she brought him a statue of his favorite saint from home in hopes that it would give him comfort and he could fight his illness and he could put his faith in his saint, that they will heal him. But the boy was asleep when she was there, and she just placed the saint in his hands while he slept. So when he woke up, he noticed the saint in his hands, and he threw it against the wall, and he was pissed. And at the top of his lungs, he started cursing God and anything else and everyone as loud as he could so anyone could hear it. He basically was wishing that God himself would contract a disease like this young boy had so he could feel the suffering that this little boy was going through, because he felt he should be a kid and out playing and doing what kids do, not in hospital in pain. So, of course, after yelling and screaming and cursing and damning God and whatnot, night comes and the boy is in more pain than he's ever been. It's super intense. And this part of the story I think is kind of strange. It would never ever happen today. So he's in so much pain that he actually wanders from his hospital room outside and into the cemetery. This must be the hospital that is in every horror movie when they show the killer and you're like the only person in the hospital. There's no staff, there's no security, there's no one. This must be that hospital because they let this little kid out to wander the streets in pain. So he wanders the cemetery and morning comes and he didn't come back. He not in his room. And then people, start their day, and as they pass the cemetery, they notice the boy hanging from a tree in the cemetery from his hospital sheets. His sheets was in the form of a noose, and he was just hanging there. And so obviously he died. So, many years later, people have said that at night they have seen what looks like a boy hanging from a tree inside the cemetery from where he left. One of the things it did say about the story is they tell it to children so they never lose their faith. That look at what this little boy did. He cursed God and God punished him. I think it's a bit extreme. I grew up Catholic, and yes, we were taught never to, curse God and all that. And I'm not super religious by any means, but I don't believe that there is any God out there that if you curse them is going to punish you and hang you from a tree while you're already suffering from some kind of terminal disease. That's bad enough. So that's a weird story that goes with the cemetery, but I figured, I might as well tell them all. So now we arrive at the last one, and I actually think this is the best legend that comes from the cemetery. In fact, this is the story I found that kind of put me on the path to everything that has gone on with the cemetery, where the other stories came from. So I figured, we'll have appetizers, and this is the main course. Now, the name of the legend is the Vampire of Guadalajara. And of course, I know everybody loves vampires, Twilight, and all that stuff. I was not a fan of Twilight, but I do find vampires an interesting subject. So basically the story starts in the mid-1800s. Scores of animals had been found dead all around this, in Guadalajara, in this area. The one thing they noticed about the animals were there was no blood in their bodies. I don't know if they noticed it when they were cleaning them up, but they were drained of their blood. But no one really gave it any thought. They're animals. Maybe something happened. Maybe it bled out somewhere else. Again, nothing that alarmed anyone at all. However, a few nights after the animals had been found, they found the body of a woman in a dark alley. She was also drained of all her blood. And actually, they did notice that she had a savage wound on her neck. This, of course, becomes a little bit alarming. But they think, all right, something must have happened. She got into a fight. It's a dark alley. It is what it is. It's a terrible, tragedy that she was killed. But they go about their business. A few days later, another body is found. This body actually had been dug up in the cemetery. They had been buried. They had passed away. They had been buried a day or two prior. So basically they were a fresh corpse. And somebody had dug the grave, took the coffin out, and back in the 1800s, they did not drain the bodies of the blood. So whoever took the body was found drained of all its blood. And there was a wound on the neck. It says it wasn't as savage, but again, the other woman had been alive. So maybe she fought off the attacker, where if you're going to attack a dead body, they're obviously not going to fight back. Again, a little bit alarming. People are starting to get on edge, but they nothing comes out. No one's looking, they're looking, but they're not looking that hard. The following week, they find several bodies. There are several children and another woman, all drained of their blood, all with the same wound on their necks. These bodies were all found on the outskirts of the Santa Paula Cemetery. This now turns, the village or the city alarmed. All right, we had one is a murder, two suspicious. Now we have tons. And the people are starting to get scared. They're getting worried. And what happens? They start to spread rumors. And of course, the rumors they spread, it must be a vampire. So of course, back, in the days, they did probably more so of a neighborhood watch than we'd ever have today. So they decide to keep an eye on the cemetery. The bodies are found near the cemetery, so obviously whoever's doing this either hunts in the cemetery or right around it. So if they're going to find who's doing this, that's where they're going to find them. So it says one morning, and I'm thinking it's early morning, still dark, maybe after midnight, 1, 2 in the morning, a group of men who are patrolling the area come across a man who's actually walking around the cemetery. It looks to them that he is actually checking for a fresh grave. So this is what alarms this group of do-gooders. So they decide to start to approach the man. As they're getting closer, the man who's walking around the cemetery notices them, turns and snarls at them, and starts acting strange, almost unhuman. Now, in the 1800s, this would be super creepy. Nowadays, we would just assume you're in Florida. So the men confirm that this must be a vampire. He's acting weird. He isn't communicating. So they decide to move forward. They knock him down, and they drive a stake through his heart. They're not convinced that necessarily is going to keep him dead, because a vampire, as everyone would know, is the undead. So he's already dead, and he's walking around. We just put a stake through his heart, which put him down, but we need to make sure he doesn't get up and he isn't going to terrorize the people that just did this. So they dig an extra deep grave and top it off with a layer of concrete. This way, there is no way this guy can possibly come back to life of some sort and escape. So after a couple weeks, people start to notice that the concrete is starting to crack and fracture a bit. So of course they're like, great, now the vampire's trying to escape. And that freaks them out even more, probably more so than the thought that there is a vampire walking around. Because now they're going to assume that he's pissed off and he's coming for everybody. Some other people kind of looked around the area and they realized that there's a tree fairly close to where they dug this grave. And the tree somehow sprouted roots that went right underneath the concrete, and as they were growing underneath it, they grew up a little and they broke the concrete. What I actually find that kind of creeped me out about it is how quickly they noticed the cracking and it possibly being roots from the time they actually buried this person. In a couple weeks, that's a pretty fast growing tree. I'm not saying I believe that the guy was trying to escape the grave. I just thought it was weird that the tree grew that fast. So, of course, as time went on, this tree became known as the vampire tree. And the legend of the tree, because of course there's going to be a legend, says that if you cut into the tree or break off the bark, the tree will bleed because of the vampire it's holding down. They also believe that if that tree dies, that he would be able to come back and get out from his grave. So the local government, whether they believe it or not, but just to be on the safe side, actually put a fence around the tree to keep it safe. So no one could screw with the tree or hurt it or kill it, or just to be on the safe side that this guy is not going to get out and not going to terrorize Guadalajara anymore. So I thought it was pretty interesting that one single cemetery in Guadalajara has so many different legends. And I'm sure there are actually more than just the few that I told you about. Some probably just basic, weirdness. And others that are probably pretty damn creepy. But one thing I kind of wanted to go a little further with was the vampire thing. Of course, when you look online and, you see how Hollywood shows us vampires, you're going to say there's no way that ever could have existed. But who's to say the idea had to come from somewhere? Who's to say that vampires did exist. And maybe not the way that we see them in Hollywood, but some form of that. Because obviously the idea came from somewhere, but it didn't necessarily have to have come from a movie or something like that. I thought it was, so I did a little searching, and there actually have been a few discoveries that shocked people over the years that argue the fact that vampires could be an actual thing, more so than Twilight and what you'll find in an Anne Rice book, of course. So, what I did find was about, I think they said an estimate of over 100 skeletons in a medieval city in Bulgaria had been excavated. And when they found the skeletons, they all had stakes through their hearts. An archaeologist who actually found them, found the first one and started to find more as he went and realized this was some type of graveyard, said that it seemed like the townspeople for this medieval city had been at war with what looked like should have been vampires. Their, everything was intact. Their skeletons looked like everybody else's except for the stakes through the heart. Another spot that really questions the idea of it was in Poland. On the outskirts of a small town in Poland, they actually came across 3 skeletons. They didn't have wooden stakes. They had iron stakes through their heart. But they also looked like whoever killed them really was trying to kill them. It was a fear killing maybe. They were making sure that person was truly dead and was not going to get up and come after them. They had said that one of the skeletons was decapitated. There was another one that they found where the knees were broken, and they had, obviously when the body went down, they piled rocks on the back of the head so that they couldn't get back up and come after them. So these are 2 examples in 2 different places, and they did actually turn around and say that the skeletons found in Poland and all the skeletons found in Bulgaria were all from around the same time frame. So the skeletons were believed to be about the same age. So, and I get it. Now, back in whatever time period that they believed these existed, because they didn't really say a time period, that, there were always different kind of rituals and different type of burials for, religious or for cities or tribes or whatever the case that maybe were outside the norm. But like Poland, there were only 3. It was on the outskirts of a city or a village or whatever. If it was more of a ritual thing, and even the same for Bulgaria, if it was a ritual thing, to me I feel like there would be many. You would find, let's say there were 1,000 people that lived there. You'd find 1,000 graves all the same way. We would have heard stories about, this area when the people would die, they would make sure they were dead and stab them in the heart with a spike. We would have heard more stories that kind of could trace back to this odd ritual if it wasn't a vampire thing. Like I said, I'm not saying that vampires are real or anything like that is real. I don't know. I have no idea. I'm just putting it out there that who's to say that they're not? That there wasn't some form of vampire that existed at some point that maybe was killed off because they attacked people and they drained them of their blood. But maybe they weren't immortal, obviously, and people figured out a way to kill them, and that, like the dinosaurs, they became extinct. It's just food for thought. It definitely is something that isn't an impossibility in my mind, and I'm sure if I did more research, there's going to be more about it somewhere, and more of an argument that they did exist. I'd be curious to hear what everybody else, thinks. Do you think that vampires exist or existed? Do you think they exist now? Do they walk, the same streets we do, and we just don't notice? That could be a possibility. Like those shows, they seem to live in New Orleans. Do you think they live there? And there's just so much culture and voodoo and all that, it kind of gets lost, and we're not even seeing what's right in our faces. I'd be curious to hear, do you think they exist or ever did? My opinion, yes, I do believe they did exist. I don't believe they still exist. But let me know. Definitely, you can reach out, the Dark Cellar Podcast at gmail.com. Follow me on Instagram. Send me a message, the Dark Cellar Podcast. I'll put up some pictures of anything I could find about the Santa Paula Cemetery and our 4 stories, and maybe some vampire stuff if I can find stuff that maybe proves or disproves my opinion. And yeah, so until next time, I appreciate everybody. I appreciate your comments. If you have an idea for me, reach out, let me know. And till next time, have a wonderful evening.